Canada is refusing to back down. And that bold move could change the trade fight with the United States. While Canada stands strong to protect its own workers and businesses, American companies could end up paying more and facing bigger problems. President Trump's administration has kept a 50% Section 232 tariff on Canadian steel in place for more than a year, arguing it is necessary to protect American national security and domestic steel production. The administration's position, articulated through U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, is that any reduction in that tariff depends on Canada accepting what officials describe as the price of access to the American market, meaning Canada drops its own counter-tariffs first and Washington decides afterward whether American steel duties on Canada come down. Prime Minister Mark Carney's answer has been consistent for months: no. Carney addressed the dispute directly at an April 2026 news conference, framing the steel tariff, the 25% automobile tariff, and the other duties applied to Canadian exports as violations of the existing trade agreement between the two countries. These are violations of our trade deal, Carney said, rejecting the premise that Canada's counter-tariffs are the problem requiring resolution. His position inverts Washington's framing entirely. The American tariffs are the violation. Canada's response is the legitimate countermeasure. Removing Canada's countermeasures without first addressing the American tariffs that triggered them is not a negotiation Carney's government will accept. That position carries forward directly into the liquor dispute that has run in parallel with the steel conflict. Carney has stated that lifting the provincial restrictions on American liquor depends specifically on Trump ending what Carney called his assault on Canadian steel, autos, and lumber, connecting multiple separate trade disputes into a single negotiating position that requires American tariff removal before any Canadian retaliatory measure comes off the table. The structure of Carney's approach across every front of the trade conflict has remained the same. Canada will not unilaterally disarm while American tariffs remain in place. The scale of Canadian steel and aluminum exposure to the American market explains why this dispute carries weight beyond a single industry. Canada remains America's largest foreign supplier of steel, accounting for roughly 22% of all U.S. steel imports. Canada also supplies nearly half of all U.S. aluminum imports. Those figures describe an integration between the two economies that the tariff structure has not been able to unwind despite 18 months of sustained pressure. American manufacturers, automotive plants, construction firms, appliance makers, defense contractors continue purchasing Canadian steel and aluminum because the supply chains connecting Canadian mills to American factories were built over decades and cannot be replaced by domestic American production at equivalent volume or cost in any near-term timeframe. Rather than allow the tariff pressure to weaken Canada's domestic steel industry, Ottawa has moved in the opposite direction, strengthening it through direct government action. The federal government introduced procurement policies that prioritize Canadian-made steel for federal infrastructure and defense projects, formalized through the Buy Canadian policy launched in December 2025. That policy requires federal agencies and crown corporations to favor Canadian suppliers in major procurement decisions, creating guaranteed domestic demand for Canadian steel producers regardless of what happens to their American export volumes. The government has also provided direct financial support to major steel producers in Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, and Quebec, the three primary steel manufacturing hubs in the country, all of which have faced documented financial pressure from the American tariff regime. Algoma Steel, based in Sault Ste. Marie, reported a net loss of $159.4 million in a single quarter, with $27.4 million in direct tariff costs, and has been actively restructuring its commercial book away from American exposed coil production toward Canadian plate markets and defense steel applications. That restructuring reflects exactly the strategic shift the federal procurement policy was designed to support, redirecting Canadian steel capacity toward guaranteed domestic government demand, rather than continuing to depend on an American export market subject to a 50% tariff with no clear resolution timeline. Reported in June 2025 that Trump and Carney remain in direct contact over the tariff dispute, according to Canadian government officials, confirming that despite the public confrontation in statements and press conferences, The two leaders maintain an active communication channel through which the broader negotiation continues. That direct contact has not yet produced a public breakthrough on steel, aluminum, or the broader CUSMA framework, but its existence indicates the dispute has not escalated into a complete breakdown of bilateral engagement. Trade war between the United States and Canada shows the steel and aluminum tariff escalation as one continuous thread running through the broader conflict, beginning with the original Section 232 tariffs, escalating through the June 2025 increase from 25% to 50%, and continuing through the parallel Canadian countermeasures imposed in response. Blake's legal timeline of key tariff dates and documents confirms that Canada's countermeasures have remained largely consistent in structure since their initial implementation, targeting specific categories of American steel and steel-related products, with reciprocal tariff rates designed to apply commercial pressure proportionate to the American measures. The negotiating impasse over steel sits inside the larger structural disagreement defining the entire CUSMA review process. Washington's position, as articulated by USTR Greer, treats Canadian counter-tariff removal as a precondition for any American tariff relief, effectively asking Canada to accept the American tariffs as a permanent fixture while giving up its own leverage in exchange for the, quote, possibility, not the certainty, of future American concessions. Carney's position treats the American tariffs themselves as the violation requiring resolution first, with Canada's countermeasures functioning as a proportionate response that will be withdrawn only when the underlying American measures that triggered them are removed. Neither government has shown public signs of abandoning its position. The 50% Section 232 tariff on Canadian steel remains in effect. Canada's reciprocal countermeasures on American steel products remain in effect. The Buy Canadian procurement policy continues directing federal infrastructure and defense spending toward domestic steel producers. And Algoma Steel, Stelco in Hamilton, and the Quebec steel sector continue receiving federal support designed to sustain Canadian steel production capacity through a trade conflict that has now persisted for more than a year without a negotiated resolution. The dispute extends beyond steel into the full architecture of the bilateral trading relationship under the current American administration. Manufacturers, infrastructure projects, supply chains, and workers on both sides of the border continue operating inside the uncertainty the unresolved tariff structure creates. With the CUSMA review process running in parallel, the direct Trump-Carney communication channel still active, and neither government having signaled the kind of unilateral concession that would break the current deadlock. The CUSMA review's July 1st checkpoint adds direct pressure to whichever government moves first on steel. A negotiated resolution on steel and aluminum tariffs would almost certainly need to happen inside the broader CUSMA framework, rather than as a standalone bilateral fix, since the Section 232 measures sit outside the formal trade agreement's tariff structure entirely and require separate negotiation, regardless of what the CUSMA review itself produces. That means even a successful 16-year CUSMA extension would not automatically resolve the steel dispute unless both governments specifically negotiate steel and aluminum terms as part of that broader package. Canadian steel producers, American manufacturers buying Canadian steel, and the workers employed across both supply chains are waiting on two parallel negotiations to resolve simultaneously the CUSMA renewal itself and the separate Section 232 tariff structure that neither side has agreed to fold into the same conversation.